were here when I told you people about Everett Dirksen, who's over my head and behind me. He had that argument made in 1964 by Southern legislators that it was up to the states. And he worked out compromises to make it acceptable to them, but they still, none of them voted for the Civil Rights or the Voting Rights Act, which Everett Dirksen did and all the Republicans did then when it was the party of Lincoln. I now yield. Jamie, you're not going to be our cleanup hitter because we now have two other powerful hitters, Ms. Bush and Ms. Jackson Lee, but you're going to go at this present time to recognize the Honorable Jamie Raskin. For
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Before I begin, did Ms. McBath want to take a moment, or
she's spoken twice? Thank you. She recognized and thank you for your offer.
Here. I heard my friend Mr. Roy right when I got back to the office. Unfortunately, I didn't hear what prompted him to launch into a defense of his family and so on. But I was moved by what he had to say, and it reminded me that that American history has been transformed by coalitions between African Americans and members of other disadvantaged minority groups and working class white people who also have been targeted for political exclusion and disenfranchisement. I'm just wondering whether Ms. Eiffel or Mr. Sands would want to opine about there are certain disenfranchising mechanisms like the white primaries in Texas, the subject of Smith versus Allwright and Terry versus Adams, which were racially specific. Literacy tests, I think, were used that way, but there also were a bunch of them that were targeted at both the African-American population and the white working class, like poll taxes, I think were imposed across the board. And I just wonder, I'm not quite sure what got Mr. Roy upset about what someone had said, but I don't think anybody would deny that there have been white people disenfranchised, certainly under the wealth and property qualifications that America began with. What we're fighting for is universal voting rights for everybody. So I don't know, Ms. Eiffel, Ms. Sands, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, let me see if I can do this very quickly because Congressman Raskin, thank you for the question. I feel I must respond to Congressman Johnson about the supposed frivolity of lawsuits challenging the Georgia voter suppression law. LDF is challenging the voter suppression law. We're also challenging the voter suppression law in Florida. And in both cases, the judge in Georgia, a Trump appointee, has denied the state's motion to dismiss, which tells you that these are not frivolous claims. These are not press releases. These are legitimate cases that will go forward and the courts will decide the strength of those claims. Congressman Raskin, absolutely, and certainly many of the provisions that we think about, automatic voter registration, absentee voting, when we talk about drop boxes outside the Board of Elections, the people they most benefit are those who are disabled and the elderly. We should be expanding the vote for everyone. Texas's voter ID law that we successfully challenged, our client in that case was a student at a Texas State University who could no longer use her student ID to vote, but of course could if she had a concealed gun carry permit. But that also doesn't mean that we deny the targeting of Black and brown voters that has happened in the country since we received the right to vote after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The Voting Rights Act was designed to address that for a reason. And we can't deny that history simply by pointing to the fact that there has been widespread oppression across the board of many people without wealth. Thank you so much for that. Mr. Science, did you want to add anything to that?
I would just add that your point is absolutely accurate. Voting rights laws benefit everyone. We see collateral disenfranchised when it comes to voter ID, which often has a very significant impact based on class and economics. In Arizona, we found that the attempt to restrict voter registration, new registrants being required to produce a birth certificate or other proof of citizenship, had effects on young voters of all races who were choosing to register for the first time, and on the elderly who had difficulty obtaining the proof of their citizenship. So it is absolutely true that there are collateral disenfranchised and that voting rights laws, like all civil rights laws, benefit every American.
I think we're in this situation today because of the Supreme Court's successful efforts to gut the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Holder and the Brnovich decision. There's been a war from the bench against the Voting Rights Act, against civil rights legislation generally. Are we at a point when we can recognize that federal statutes, including the the most powerful voting rights statute we ever had, the Voting Rights Act of 65, are not enough. And we need a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right to vote, because all we've got is sort of a ragtag sequence of anti-discrimination amendments. You can't discriminate on the basis of race, the 15th Amendment on basis of gender, the 19th Amendment. So nowhere do you have what exists in most democratic constitutions, which is a universal grant of the right to vote to all citizens at every level of government. Is it time for us to do that? Mr. Henderson, let me start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin, for the question. It's a very important question, and I believe you are right that a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right to vote to all American citizens would be a powerful tool that would help resolve many of the disputes that we're talking about now. Having said that, the likely adoption and ratification of such an amendment is virtually impossible. One need only look at what's going on now with an effort to restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965 based on the requirements imposed by the Supreme Court in the Shelby County decision. Many of us believe that the court offered a roadmap to the appropriate reauthorization of that act, even if we disagreed with the holding itself. But there are some who suggest that the court cynically established a challenge which it knew quite well would be impossible to achieve, based on the fact that there was inherent skepticism about the effort to really establish the existence of discrimination. We think the House Judiciary Committee and the Senate have helped modernize the formula that the court required be considered in an update of the Voting Rights Act.
Okay, but let me, if I could pause you there, Mr. Henderson, I just wanted to ask the minority witness whether you would agree to a constitutional amendment establishing a right of all citizens to vote. Ms. Roden.
Yes, I would.
So, and that would, I think, would be the best answer, Mr. Henderson. Maybe we could get people together around the principle of a constitutional right to vote. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. I appreciate it. Mr. Roy, are you with us again? I see your camera's on. If not, I was going to let him out of the sand trap that he was in when he left us. He's apparently, so I would, Mr. Johnson, you have any other